When we start looking at horror films, of course we need to think about the universal classics. Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, the Invisible Man. These creatures were horrifying more because at the time, film was still a novelty, so there was a fantastical element to everything. It was a chance to see something unusual and strange. You couldn't see Todd Browning's Freaks anywhere else but the cinema. And the luxury of such fantastical horrors is once you left the cinema, well, those horrors could stay there and you could go on your merry way. But then horror started to become a little more refined. The genre's always been about terror and tension, but the films that stand the test of time offer more than just a few cheap jump scares. The killer represents a fear more deeply instilled in society, and so it's not the killer, but the idea that is so scary. Now, I've gone through Hollywood's history and I've examined some of the successful horror films. Then I looked to what was going on at the time in society and saw if any links could be drawn. And crazily enough, many of the mainstays in horror fit the bill. Now, it should be noted that while I'm discussing these films, I won't heavily be dealing with plot, but I may occasionally dip into spoiler territory. But there is an annotation which will allow you to skip to the next movie and avoid any of that. With all those things in mind, let's dive into some societal scares, shall we? Now, Invasion of the Body Snatchers stuck with the theme of fantasy sci-fi, as was popular in the 50s. However, it was infusing something that was very relevant at the time. Everybody's favorite fear after World War II. Communism! The Red Scare had every good capitalist pointing fingers at his neighbor, and the man who started all that finger pointing was good old Senator Joseph McCarthy. Of course, to tackle McCarthyism head-on would have been Hollywood suicide. You'd be put on the blacklist, and you'd basically never work in this town again, possibly be jailed, essentially your life would be screwed. But the plot, let's dabble with that. The film revolves around a doctor who comes to the realization that all those around him are being taken over and turned into emotionless pod people. Again, it's the 50s, so it's schmaltzy and sci-fi, but it works. He then basically turns into the town crier as he realizes the horrors that are surrounding him. So who's that guy? Well, many of the critics assume that he is supposed to be Joseph McCarthy, and all the pod people he's calling out are communists. Once the Russians got a hold of you, you'd be taken into one of those pods and churned out as a commie. And in turn, you do it to your friends and their friends, and then soon the whole United States would be red. There's actually been some dispute between the creative forces as to whether or not this was an intended allegory, like in the case of The Crucible, or was just mere sci-fi schlock that happened to capture the zeitgeist. Whether either claim is true, the fear of communism was very real, and that's why the Invasion of the Body Snatchers struck home as well as it did. Of course, the idea of a wolf in sheep's clothing doesn't just stop with Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You might have heard of this guy, Alfred Hitchcock, and you might have also heard of this movie Psycho. Just to overview plot a little bit, the movie starts with Janet Leigh, a respected starlet at the time, whose boss gives her $40,000 to deposit at the bank. However, she does not deposit at the bank. No, she takes the money and runs. She plans on meeting up with her boyfriend and splitting the keep. However, a storm brews and she's forced to stay at a motel. The Bates Motel. So she goes ahead and checks into the motel owned by a Norman Bates and his seemingly overbearing mother. The Bates Motel. And then she decides, you know, she's $40,000 richer, she'll give herself a celebration shower, which sounds actually kind of dirty. But said shower is interrupted by 45 seconds that changed cinema forever. Now, you have to understand that Murder and Hitchcock were pretty close friends at this point. That's not what was so shocking about the shower scene. What was shocking is the way that sex and violence was displayed, how fast it was cut. Most importantly, the murder itself was unmotivated and executed by a seemingly normal person. The normal person thing, that's the scary part. Norman Bates on the surface appeared very normal. However, like many of our boys returning home from World War II, traumatic events had jostled something in their mind, resulting in psychological problems. The world was just coming to terms with the ideas of schizophrenia, psychoanalysis. The nature versus nurture question was being brought up, but when you apply it to Psycho either way, the result isn't pretty. From the nature end of things, you can assume that Norman Bates was always crazy. However, from the nurture standpoint, you can assume that his mother might have in fact been crazy, and putting so much pressure on Norman caused him to also lose his mind. And what's so great is that Hitchcock never provides a clear explanation. So the conversation of what made Bates crazy can continue. Add on top of that we're starting to see the word serial killer enter into the public vocabulary. Folks like Ed Gein who are being declared clinically insane. Seemingly normal people on the outside, very disturbed on the inside. It's like they were all gushers of crazy. Society was like, oh, what a nice normal fruit snack. And then they bite into it and they're like, holy hell, this person's nuts. Why they put nuts in gushers, I'm not sure. Oh, and I almost forgot about the campaign. Hitchcock released pamphlets in the film telling theater owners to not admit anyone after the starting of the screening. and stressed heavily for nobody to discuss the ending of the film. This created a crazy amount of buzz and urgency about seeing the film. You had to know what was so unique about the beginning or the end. Also, it should be noted that Hitchcock's face alone at this point could have sold this movie. I mean, he had the CBS show Alfred Hitchcock Presents. It's wild. When you look at his posters, it really is. His face is larger than his stars in some of these films. That was the power of this auteur, and he moved a nation to be scared. After seeing this film, you couldn't look at a shower or a motel the same way, and it just made you realize that that seemingly normal person next to you could be crazy. Now, Night of the Living Dead really kicked things off in terms of our obsession with zombies. And crazily enough, it tackled multiple social issues and concerns. The first of which happens right at the top, because you need to destroy the brain. We see that zombies are the result of a radioactive spill. An atom bomb might have brought about the end of World War II, but it also started us off into a far scarier time where nuclear arms were on the table. And it only makes sense that that sort of nuclear fallout would make the dead rise and come after us, the creators of it, to destroy us in turn. And the other social issue being addressed in Night of the Living Dead? Racism. In America during the mid to late 60s, the message of the civil rights movement was unavoidable. Just the year before, we had Sidney Poitier in 2 films dealing with racism. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and In the Heat of the Night, both of which I'd encourage you to check out because the performances on that, phenomenal. So the idea of a black protagonist wasn't groundbreaking by any means, but it highlighted the significance, or insignificance rather, that race played in any sort of event. When the chips are down, it doesn't matter if you're black, white, Chinese, Native American, you're human and you don't want to be eaten by the undead, so you best band together. The idea of putting our differences aside for the greater good of humanity is an ongoing theme in all zombie movies. If we work together, we're an undefeatable force. But it's those differences that are gonna get us. And we see constantly that the abrasive personality is the one who tends to get picked off. And we tend to see with zombie films that the cast is incredibly diverse ethnically. It's like every picture on the inside of Health Book. They're just shy of having a person in a wheelchair, and we know the only reason that they don't have one is because they all saw Texas Chainsaw Massacre. What's most interesting about George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, though, is its ending. Our hero Ben makes it all the way to dawn, only to be shot by some bigoted asshole, showing that the infected in the head are far worse than the undead. Okay, so if humanity is the thing that we should actually fear, but we really do like the slow shuffling of zombies, what would be the perfect hybrid of the two? Ah, The Shape. How you doing, John Carpenter's Halloween? It's been a while. We're now looking at a very different America. We don't have Leave It to Beaver households as divorce rates are on the rise. Our president is even capable of scandal, and the world around us is becoming increasingly dangerous. We just wanted to be safe in our homes. So John Carpenter took the danger there. Now you have to understand that Halloween didn't invent the slasher. It definitely popularized many of the tropes. But 4 years prior, in 1974, Black Christmas came out, yet it didn't do so hot, and I guess I can see why. Now, Black Christmas, I understand what you were trying to do, and I actually enjoy you quite a bit. However, releasing your film a week before Christmas isn't the smartest idea, and very few American families are going to be like, nothing's more jolly than seeing a bunch of sorority girls killed. And it also probably doesn't help that your release date was the same as The Godfather Part 2's. Kinda gonna be hard to compete with that. But back to the home and the danger that lurks in it. Now, the idea of a fragmented home and parental negligence had been addressed in The Exorcist. If only Mom had been around more, poor Linda Blair wouldn't have been possessed by the devil. But the idea that even with care and nurturing, that someone can still be attacked is equally scary. That's why having the babysitter be the one in danger struck home for so many Americans. Everybody has had a babysitter. Oh, and fun fact, Jamie Lee Curtis is the daughter of Janet Leigh. You know, the one who got killed in the shower scene? Like, how crazy is that? Casting? However, the similarities to Psycho don't just stop there. When developing the antagonist of the film, Michael Myers, John Carpenter set out to make him move like a man, not a monster. And yet there was something so very monstrous about Myers. It's that empty mask. His mask is a milky white, emotionless and featureless, allowing for any of your fears to be projected on it. And that's pretty clever when you go to a theater to see your fears projected on a screen, and then more specifically it's on the mask, because it's how clever is that? Admittedly, while Halloween may not pull directly on any single societal theme, it brought fear back to the American home and reminded us that no place was really safe anymore, while also serving as a template for so many slasher films to follow, like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and one of my personal favorites, Scream. So what John Carpenter was doing with Halloween was very purposeful. It wasn't just a stab in the dark. That was a dad joke. Now, I've talked about Scream before, but this is Wes Craven at his very best. He saw that the slasher film was dying and gave it an unlikely jolt. He parodied it with a love letter. The subjects of his film were aware of the horror motifs, however they still fell victim to Ghostface's blade. But the true horror of Scream was the killer's identity, because Craven threw this one to the kids. The killer was a teenager. Nothing like that had happened before. But now that you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. In '92, Rock the Vote started, and that played heavily into the election of Bill Clinton. The youth were empowered in affecting the country. We're also dealing with an MTV generation, more heavily fueled by media. And when we see things like the O.J. Simpson trials being sensationalized, you've now got a pretty deadly combination. Scream is examining the relationship between youth and media, and revealing how it might contribute to a warped perception of reality. This conversation actually takes place in movie. The hero of our film confronts the murderer, saying that perhaps this is a result of seeing one too many movies. However, the killer retorts that movies don't make psychos, but they make psychos more creative. Not only did Scream open the floodgates for more creative slashers, but they also resulted in a series of real-life copycat murders. Craven was even called out multiple times to release public apologies for the film. So while Craven's intention may have just been to revitalize the slasher genre, he actually wound up discovering a lot more about society than he planned on. A horror film also inspired by the media is The Blair Witch Project. With films released in 1999, reality television was everywhere, and the film's creators were seeing how readily people became invested with cast members from the show The Real World, and they thought, hey, if people can get behind these somewhat staged real performances, then why not try to get them behind these characters who will in turn get scared? Maybe that'll translate. And translate it did, because The Blair Witch had an amazing campaign behind it. But to understand the campaign, first you have to know the plot. 3 Maryland film students are piecing together a documentary around the Blair Witch urban legend. But now those 3 students have gone missing, and it seems that they and their footage have become part of the legend itself. Well, that was the plot. Now back to that campaign. The film would tour from college campus to college campus, however, none of the 3 cast members would be present. A representative from the film distribution company would say, oh, hey, here's this film that we pieced together, check it out. And this lended itself to the credibility that maybe these kids were lost, and this film is, in fact, real. That made the film that much more scary. And it just goes to show, be it a name like Hitchcock or a micro-budget found footage film, with a good concept and campaign, you can build buzz and get your audience. The film was almost a warning of the lie that it was presenting. If you fell for the idea that the Blair Witch Project was real, you'd fall further down the rabbit hole. Too many people were simply accepting what was being presented as true and real. However, to be fair, this film is very time sensitive. A film like this couldn't succeed in this day and age, cause, you know, the internet's a thing. I mean, in 1999, we were like still content with AIM. And man, oh man, did we love the hamster dance. Baba-dee-da-dee-da-do-do, dee-da-dee-da-do. Just moving around in a circle, cause I'm just a cool gif. Like seriously, who doesn't love the hamster dance? Now I'm starting to enter a realm that's a little harder to define with words such as staying power as we're getting more and more current. However, I feel this guy's worth mentioning. I mean, Saw was a huge box office success, spawning 6 sequels and creating the subgenre of torture porn, or gornography. Saw revolves around the killer Jigsaw, who concocts various traps for his victims, appropriately themed for whatever crimes they may have committed. You see, Jigsaw views himself somewhat as a hand of justice. He's hoping to turn those misguided people to the light, either to a righteous path, or when they die, they'll see the light. What you see in Saw is people's wills being tested. It's the question of how far would you go? And as horrifying as it was on screen, it was even more horrifying realizing that torture was going on overseas. Yet national security and horror seem to really like one another. They translate into one another just so well. It's like Alta Vista Battlefish. Sorry, I'm still stuck in a 90s internet mindset. Does anyone want to bid on my Pokemon cards on eBay? There's some foilies. We were living in a post 9/11 era, and every tactic was being used to get information about terrorists. And in many cases, those tactics were torture. And the world was shocked to know that Americans were waterboarding detainees or torturing prisoners. So when you view it through that lens, Americans' disgust with Jigsaw was their disgust with the military and the government and their way of going through and achieving justice. And it's made even more scary when Jigsaw refers to it as a game. But what he sees as the moral thing to do, others may say it was for security. And security continues to be a theme here when we look to films such as Paranormal Activity. Well, initially it may just strike you as watching people sleep. When you delve deeper, it's asking the question of security versus privacy. You have the couple Katie and Micah now suffering from disturbances in their home. And for the sake of security, they install cameras. Now their private life has become public as Micah scrolls through all the footage of what happens during the night. Again, this is a horror film that draws heavily on what's unseen, and at the same time, through throughout society, we've seen that there's a fear in the unknown. So it's the idea of better safe than sorry. We'll give up our privacy for the sake of security. But what's so scary is that even when they give up that privacy, they aren't safe. Evidence of paranormal activity won't protect them. This danger is still lurking and very much going to attack and harm them. They have the knowledge, yet they're still doomed. It's something that doesn't leave you with comfort because the evil will continue to lurk. So be it a communist, a racist, a psychopath, or a terrorist, fear lurks in darkness and those unknowns. They'll get embodied in masks or demonic possessions. But while these things may scare us, they can also inform us, teach us a little bit more about ourselves, and we won't be so scared of society around us and all the things that go bump in the night. So that was an overview of popular horror films that may have been informed by societal fears. Leave your thoughts on anything I discussed in the comments below. And of course, if you want, you can check out previous reviews or follow me on any of them social networking sites, be it Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr. So comment, click, and keep loving movies, guys. As for me, well, I'm still stuck in that 90s mindset. So let's just hamster dance it up. But seriously, bet on these Pokemon cards.